All right, everybody, welcome again. I think this is I'm impressed you're all still here. Hopefully this is also the last live session that I'm going to be stuck with this hardware that causes some problems, limits what I can do. So forgive him today, and then after that, hopefully I'm able to set it up. We'll take a little bit of a break from these live sessions so I can get the new hardware squared away, and then should be off to the races then. What I wanted to talk about was, well, what if after effects are we seeing from the passage of Tropical Storm Hilary? What's the content and what didn't unfold? And what are maybe the medium-term consequences of all this extra water that we've put into the system at kind of an unusual time of year? One thing I'll start with, maybe not the most consequential, but it's relevant because it's ongoing, is that there still are some after effects of the moisture and instability in the air from Hilary in central California. And I say this because there's a pair of severe thunderstorms right now over I-5 in the Central Valley, south of Newman, one of which has a tornado warning attached to it currently. So it's even possible there could be a brief tornado on the scattered strong to locally severe thunderstorms that may form on the backside of Hilary this afternoon in parts of the Central Valley. You never know what can happen on the backside of these sorts of unusual systems. So although most of the rain in California is done now, there will be additional showers and some scattered stronger thunderstorm activity across the interior Central Valley today. Maybe a few isolated showers in the Bay Area as well. I know there have already been a few of those earlier this morning. And unfortunately, it does not look like any meaningful rainfall will make it to the far northwestern corner of California, where there are pretty serious ongoing wildfires with evacuations and structure losses being reported from some of those lightning fires last week, lest we forget about that story, nor any of the major wildfires burning in the interior of British Columbia, Washington, or Oregon. So most of this moisture is going to get shunted to the east. It will make it up into parts of Idaho and western Montana. It won't be nearly as an extreme precipitation event up there as it was in parts of California and Nevada, but it does look like that it will unfortunately miss most of the drought-stricken and now wildfire-stricken regions of the Pacific Northwest. So that's sort of what we're thinking about now. If you are in the Central Valley, do keep an eye out for those isolated strong to severe thunderstorms today. And also be prepared for some smoke to potentially mix in with the clouds up north, because on the return flow on the backside of this departing now non-tropical low-pressure system associated with former Tropical Storm Hilary, there are winds from north to south along the coast, so some of the smoke from the Pacific Northwest in California will get blown southward toward the Bay Area, Central California, today and tomorrow. So despite the fact that we just experienced a tropical storm in Southern California, we could be dealing with some smoke issues immediately after. Not necessarily from smoke in Central or Southern California, but smoke from fires further north. Let's see here. So what happened with this landfall? Interesting thing that appeared to have occurred yesterday is the most and in the recent live sessions was that the track of Hilary might wobble somewhat as it approached California, and this is indeed exactly what happened. There was considerable wobbling of the actual center of the storm itself. It's clear that Hilary made an initial landfall in northern Baja California. But what is less clear now, there may have actually been a second landfall because the storm itself ended up taking a slightly more westerly track at the far western edge of the forecast envelope. Instead of entering Southern California over the mountains east of San Diego, it appears to have gone more or less directly over San Diego and paralleled the western coastline of California between San Diego and Orange County, before ending up going inland directly over Los Angeles. One of the forecast advisory points in the end for Tropical Storm Hilary last night was literally over downtown Los Angeles, or between downtown and Dodger Stadium, so right in the thick of things. So, did this storm end up being the first to have an actual California landfall at or above tropical storm strength since 1939? It is unclear because it was so close. The initial landfall was in Mexico, but there may actually have been a second landfall somewhere along the Los Angeles. I was just conferring with a couple of the hurricane folks about this, and this is sports are not the only context where there's postseason analysis, but in this case, it seems like the postseason analysis on this one is going to determine whether it's the first tropical storm to have an actual coastal landfall in California since 1939. Ultimately, that's a pretty academic distinction. It doesn't really matter in terms of the impacts that unfolded, but it does slightly explain why Los Angeles County and Ventura counties, especially the urban areas, ended up seeing more rain than some predictions might have suggested at the outset. It's because the storm ended up taking the very western portion of the uncertainty envelope and sort of reforming almost directly over LA last evening, which is when all of that heavy rain fell in the city and caused a bunch of urban flooding that was probably minor to moderate in severity. Nothing extraordinarily destructive, and debris flows were reported in some places. This is in contrast to some folks online claiming that the worst thing that happened was street flooding. I'm hearing reports and seeing some video and visual corroboration of this that there were actually very large debris flows that took out bridges, scoured canyons, knocked down long-established trees and structures, and that some folks were fleeing their homes in the middle of the night. There was even one report of folks up high in the mountains climbing trees in the middle of the night to escape the water levels. I don't think that qualifies as minor street flooding. What's also true is that many of the interstates, and certainly almost all of the state highways in southeastern California, are currently shut down, or have been as of recently. This includes almost all of the east-west routes across the desert, all of the north-south routes, which in northeastern California, east of the Sierra, that's mainly Highway 395. That remains completely shut down for many miles, as are most of the spur roads crossing into Kern County, into Death Valley, the Ridgecrest area, the high desert down toward Mojave, all the way down towards Palmdale and the Coachella Valley. Some of the interstates have opened in maybe one direction, but some of them remain shut down, and almost all those state highways are closed, either due to water on the roadway, large amounts of debris from debris flows, so mud and rocks and other stuff, or because the roads were just washed away entirely. There are some places where there is no longer a road. This was the kind of flooding that we were talking about leading up to the event. Now, so some places did see rather severe flooding, and that extends actually into Nevada. So the Mount Charleston area saw some pretty extraordinary debris flows, again, destructive ones that there were cars and structures washing downstream, so that's not minor. But what I will say is that some areas in southeastern California did escape worst case scenario flood event. So what's interesting is that a lot of Southern California did in fact see just as much precipitation as had been predicted, but the flooding wasn't quite as extreme in some areas, especially in the southeastern deserts and into the Coachella Valley. There was still significant flooding, but I don't think it was necessarily catastrophic flooding, although that might have been true in some of these canyons that saw these massive debris flows elsewhere, and we haven't heard a lot from the 395 corridor into Death Valley yet, so remains to be seen what happened up there. So why wasn't the flooding even worse in some places? Despite the fact that numerous locations in Southern California saw their wettest August day on record. In fact, most places actually singularly did set new records for the wettest day in August, and many locations set new records for the wettest day in summer. So yesterday was the wettest day between June and August that has ever been observed for most of Southern California. That's not nothing. That's a pretty remarkable statistic, pointing to the extremity of the precipitation event that did unfold. Now, even though landfalling tropical cyclones, or the remnants thereof at least, are hardly unprecedented in Southern California, I think it's fair to say that if places with records longer than 100 years, going back to 150 years in some places, have never seen a summer day. I think it's fair to call that part of it unprecedented, even if the magnitude of the flooding that resulted wasn't necessarily. So why was that? Why was essentially spot on, but some of the flood warnings were a little bit more alarming than was actually experienced in some regions? Well, I think what actually happened was that the latent potential energy, the instability, if you will, of the atmosphere in the southeastern sector of the storm wasn't quite realized. So the maximum rainfall rates that were plausible in this air mass did not necessarily materialize. It was possible. This was the kind of setup that could potentially have produced rainfall as heavy as 3 to 4 inches per hour in some places that rarely see more than 4 inches of rain in a year in the deserts. So this was the kind of pattern that could have produced rainfall rates that high. But instead what happened is that there was a pretty thick cloud deck over the deserts. There wasn't enough sun to heat the surface of the atmosphere down by the Salton Sea early enough in the day to produce enough instability to maximize those potential rain rates. So we ended up getting almost the same amount of precipitation as had been in the forecast, but it fell at a lesser rate. Still at an extreme rate in some cases. There were certainly places that recorded rainfall rates of 1 to 2 inches per hour, but not 3 to 4 inches per hour. And it turns out that makes a huge difference. A lot of places could have seen the same amount of precipitation as they saw yesterday, but if it had fallen in half the time, the flooding would have been twice as bad or worse. And so I essentially think that's what happened, is that the atmospheric instability wasn't quite as high. There weren't as many convective bands that dropped extremely heavy tropical precipitation on the eastern flank of the storm, as might have been the case. And so even though the same amount of water fell overall, in many cases, it didn't fall as quickly as had been feared in some places. And so I think that the flood impacts, thankfully, were not as potentially catastrophic as they could have been. Was that a bad forecast? I don't think so, because there really wasn't any way to distinguish whether or not, at that lead time, whether or not those 3 to 4 inch per hour rainfall rates were actually going to materialize or not. Because we just don't have that level of granularity and sophistication. It's an extremely complicated forecast, and I think it was a good forecast in the context of what happened, particularly because it really did produce all-time record-breaking summer rainfall event across most of the region. This was the wettest tropical cyclone-associated rainfall ever recorded in this. And it's not like there wasn't flooding. There was widespread flooding. It just didn't reach catastrophic levels in very many places. Although I still think that some of the stories are yet untold, and there might be some pretty dramatic imagery to come out later. And more than has made the circulating news reports at this point. I think this is sometimes a challenge, is that the hardest hit areas often are the most inaccessible ones, and so we don't hear about them as much or as early as we do for some of the areas that have more modest problems but are more accessible, partly by virtue of the fact that they don't have as serious of damage. I am really curious to hear what happened in Death Valley. It does seem like they broke their all-time rainfall record. So, but again, the rates matter. So if that fell as steady, moderate to heavy-ish rain for 12 hours versus falling in the course of a couple hours in a huge downpour will affect whether it was a more gentle flood or a really violent one. And it really does matter. You know, the more gentle flooding, you know, the inundation of washes and arroyos, that you know, if that's what happened and there was some water over the roads in the park and that's it, that's great. I mean, that'll result in some cool desert flower blooms, stuff like that. If it fell really quickly, it might have completely washed away, you know, important pieces of park infrastructure and roads. So we'll just have to see. I haven't really heard any reports at all. The park is closed. There was widespread flooding. I just don't know the nature of the flooding, if it was ordinary Death Valley flooding or extraordinary Death Valley flooding. I don't know. We'll find out. sooner rather than later. I'm just glancing at the radar screen, and they have issued another tornado warning for I-5. If there is a tornado, it is literally on Interstate 5 right now, south of Newman. So if you happen to be out there, it's quite the photo opportunity. Just be careful. Don't do it from the freeway. If anybody sees reports that there's actually a tornado on the ground, feel free to share a link. Again, that's a pretty isolated threat right now, but it is another piece of the weirdness of what's going on in California weather. So as I mentioned, many places broke all smorgasbord of rainfall records. Some places saw a number of places saw their wettest summer day on record. Even more places saw their wettest August day on record. I am uncertain whether any place saw the single wettest day on record, except for, I believe, Palm Springs did. Don't quote me on that one because all the numbers are preliminary. But there may have been some places in the Coachella Valley that saw their wettest day on record, period. On the coast side of the mountains, it was mainly wettest summer day on record because, of course, it's not typical to get heavy summer rainfall, and so you do tend to get heavier rain days during the rainy season in winter on the west side of the mountains. So that's generally most places where the all-time record wettest record is held, although honestly in some places it came pretty close because there were a number of areas in the metro corridor that saw 2 to 4 plus inches in a 24-hour period in August. Quite extraordinary. So I think we'll probably see I think we'll probably see more images of slightly more significant damage coming out later today, but hopefully it's not super widespread, and I'm inclined to believe that's mainly because the very highest rainfall rates of 3 to 4 inches per hour didn't materialize, even though right on the money in most places. And that's an interesting consideration. In a warming climate, we actually expect that the most intense bursts of hourly precipitation intensify faster than anything else. So that's just an illustration of why those rates matter. In a place like New York City, the last couple of years, we've seen what happens when things are even higher than expected, or you get in an hour and you have extreme flash flooding. This is one example of where the flash flooding was less bad, mainly because you didn't quite get rainfall rates per hour at that extraordinary level. So just to point out that it isn't just the total volume of precipitation that matters, it really is how fast it falls, and sometimes if it falls over a 6-hour period versus a 1 or 2 hour period, can really make all the difference in terms of how bad the flooding gets. One thing I want to talk about are sort of the medium-term implications of this. Unfortunately, most of the rainfall from this event, with a few exceptions, there have been some scattered showers up there, but not widespread soaking rainfall. Hilary's remnants are not producing widespread beneficial rainfall in most of the fire zones in northwestern California or up in the Pacific Northwest or British Columbia. So unfortunately, we don't get that benefit. However, there is the benefit with respect to fire season in other places. So the Sierra Nevada, especially from the crest eastward, but even to some extent on the western slope, a more gentle, light to moderate rain fell yesterday, and that's great. I mean, that's one of the best kinds of weather you can get this time of year to attenuate fire season for a little while. In Southern California, I don't think we're going to have to worry about fires for at least a few weeks. A lot of folks say, this ended fire season. Well, in Southern California, it almost doesn't matter. Events come October, November, December, you can still have a very active fire season, assuming there isn't another precipitation event in between now and then. If we get a second tropical soaking, in September or something, then that really might be the end of fire season in Southern California this year, especially with a strong El Nino coming up. But I wouldn't rule it out yet. I will say, though, that there's likely to be a prolonged reprieve for weeks at least in Southern California and in places that got soaked on the eastern side of the Sierra as well, maybe parts of the southern Sierra too. The northern Sierra, the Bay Area, most of the central coast, the northwestern California, though, the rains that have been received are patchy and not hugely significant. I think that there will be, this won't really affect the trajectory of fire season for the northwestern half of the state approximately. It will dramatically curtail, for at least for a while, fire season in the southeastern half. sort of thinking of, drawing sort of a line at about a 45-degree angle across California, so just try and visualize that. But what's interesting is that this has already not been a particularly severe fire season in most of California. It got very active recently up in far northern, northwestern California, but elsewhere it's been pretty low key. This will help that to continue. Again, in the southern, southeastern half-ish of the state, certainly, at least for another 3 or 4 weeks. And, overall, I think we've gotten lucky this year in California. There have been some near misses. The winter floods or the spring floods could have been a lot worse, but we averted some of that potential because the storms in the winter spaced themselves out just enough, and the spring was cooler than average, which allowed that huge record-breaking Southern Sierra snowpack to melt just slowly enough to avoid more catastrophic flooding in the San Joaquin Valley. This event had, again, potential to be really bad, this flood event with Hilary, and it was in some places, but not in others. And so those rainfall rates were just low enough to avoid a much worse outcome. So we've gotten actually quite lucky. Despite the remarkable, in some cases, record-breaking extremes this year, we have just narrowly threaded the needle with these hydroclimate extremes. A little bit finger on the scale in the other direction would have made things a lot worse. I don't think we can rely on luck like this moving forward, so I'm glad we got it this year. I'm glad that as a result of all of this, for the most part, again, with the exception of our northwestern California, fire season has not been particularly bad. Good. California deserves a break after the last decade. It's been a hell of a run in many ways. So at some point, just by random luck, you've got to have a year that isn't as crazy. But the great irony is that this year that's happening in the context of almost everywhere else on Earth is experiencing almost continuously crazy, record-breaking, even record-shattering heat extremes and flood events and all of that. So all of this is unfolding in a global context where we're getting a bit of a reprieve this year, but unfortunately the reprieve, I think, is going to be more of the exception rather than the norm moving forward. So let's acknowledge it for what it is, enjoy it while we can, but not make too many assumptions that this is indicative of what we can expect moving forward. I think that the rest of the last decade in California, with increasingly severe droughts and wildfires and extreme precipitation events, are all illustrative of the long-term future. But for this year, this summer, this fall, let's take the win, as they say. So I think that's pretty much what I wanted to say about Hilary level. Continuing to glance at that radar on the screen, and there is that really impressive cluster of storms along I-5, and there's still a tornado warning, so maybe someone's going to get a cool visual there. I'm going to look at comments now, so I haven't looked at those yet, so let me take a look here. So I did discuss the impacts of Hilary on California's fire season. The answer is it really depends where you are. Definitely attenuates it in Southern California. It doesn't necessarily end it, though, because Santa Ana season is around the corner and things can dry out awfully fast when you have dew points of negative 10 Fahrenheit and 60-mile-an-hour winds. So, but this is a great opportunity, an unusual opportunity for probably for the rest of August and much of September, where Southern California probably doesn't have to worry too much about dangerous wildfires. Doesn't mean there couldn't be a fire, but it does mean that the likelihood that they get big and out of control is significantly reduced. So I do think that's a positive, clearly. 0.29 inches, I think, is what that means of rain. So if that's widespread, that's potentially enough to help with the fires in the Trinity Alps. Not enough to extinguish them, but definitely to tamp down behavior. That's assuming it's widespread, though. I think that precipitation's kind of patchy. Not totally sure about that. Honestly, it's been such a challenge to follow things elsewhere. That would be, that's certainly better than not getting a quarter inch of rain in the context of fires. And it's enough to not cause any big problems on the other side of things, too. So Again, threading the needle locally at least. A question from Marty that's interesting, or actually I'm asking on behalf of a friend, why don't hurricanes ever cross from the Caribbean into the Pacific? My initial thought was because the hurricane wants to move heat from the equator towards the poles. Are there other reasons? Well, one reason is that hurricanes don't form. So within about 10 degrees latitude on either side of the equator, there isn't enough Coriolis force to really get storms spinning. The Coriolis effect is too weak as you get right near the equator for that to happen. This is, by the way, one of the reasons why, if anybody has ever, in an equatorial country, if anybody has ever shown you how water spins the other way in wash basins or toilets on one side of a painted line versus another, they're doing good entertainment, but they're not actually showing you something that is physically real. That effect is too weak to suddenly reverse itself from one side of that painted line to the other, so that's a bit of a sleight of hand. The Coriolis effect is, of course, very real, but it only operates on much larger spatial scales, on the scale of a tropical cyclone, for example. That's a big enough event. Storms spin for that reason, because of the existence of the Coriolis force. But in that case, if you're within 10 degrees of the equator, you're too close to it. And then in Central America, if you're more than 10 degrees from the equator, includes high mountains. So, most of Central America actually has quite a tall mountain range, or mountain ranges going down the middle of it. And so that tends to tear storms to shreds if they try and cross. Now, that's not universally true, and there actually are at least a handful of instances where storms in greatly weakened state do survive the trek across Central America and then re-strengthen once they get out over into the Pacific. So usually you don't see a hurricane that stays a hurricane from the Gulf of Mexico over into the Pacific, but you might see a hurricane that weakens to a tropical storm or a tropical depression or a tropical wave, re-emerges back over the warm waters of the tropical Pacific, and then does re-strengthen again into a hurricane. In fact, Dora, the event that may have played some role in why the downslope winds were so severe during the catastrophic wildfire event on Maui a couple weeks back, did start out as a tropical Caribbean disturbance and actually has become now one of the longest-lived tropical cyclones on record. I think it's still spinning around out there somewhere, or at least it was as of a couple days ago. So that's kind of remarkable. It's just churning away and, as you mentioned, dissipating energy from transferring ocean energy to the atmosphere. Let's see here. Yeah, a comment from Mountain Kimmy that she believes they did indeed dodge a bullet around the Salton Sea area. Certainly an interesting event, but not catastrophic impacts that we braced for. Yeah, I think that's especially true down by the Salton Sea. It's a little bit less true up in parts of the San Gabriels and then the northern high desert region, where flooding was worse and more widespread. And again, I think it's mainly because of that reason I mentioned, where we didn't see those 3 to 4 inch per hour rates, those catastrophic tropical convective spiral rainband rates that could have occurred, ironically, because there wasn't enough sun to heat the ground in the southeastern deserts by the Salton Sea. If you were down there, you might have noticed that it was actually quite dark and gloomy and misty most of the day. Ironically, had there been sunnier skies then, I think the flooding would have been worse later in the day. That is sometimes how it works. All right, 2 questions from the New York Times. First is, what does this storm mean for fire risk in Southern California? I've covered that one, so I'll move on to the second one. What does this storm plus the other extreme weather events this month imply for early warnings? Well, I think, whether we're specifically talking about California in the context of Hilary or whether we're talking more broad extremes globally. Let me cover that second aspect first. What we're seeing today is in the context of a world that has warmed, and since I cut out there, let me just make this statement clear. I'll start over again. What we're seeing in the context of a world that has warmed by about 1.3, 1.4 degrees Celsius so far, and on top of that we have a strong El Nino event this year, which is adding even more fuel to the fire temporarily in terms of global temperatures and extremes, is, a lot of folks like to say where we are now is this new normal of extreme events, and including some unprecedented record-breaking extremes, particularly heat extremes and extreme precipitation and flood extremes and wildfire extremes in many places around the world. And I understand the sentiment of new normal, but I really push back against that phrasing because it suggests that we've reached some new stable plateau and that this is what we need to get used to. But the reality is, 20 years from now, a summer like this one will feel like a relatively mild summer. And again, I'm speaking more broadly than just in California. This actually was, in recent terms, a relatively mild summer in California temperature-wise. But in terms of the incredible, just frenetic pace of global extremes we're seeing this summer in terms of temperature and precipitation, that is only going to get worse as the climate continues to warm. And, we're not going to see some stabilization of that until global temperatures stop rising, and that's not going to happen for a while. We're on track to warm well more than 2 degrees, even assuming we make some pretty aggressive changes to the way we run our carbon-based societies. We're still on track to warm by somewhere around 2.5 degrees centigrade, assuming, sort of median trajectories and assuming all these pledges that we've recently signed, close to double the amount, that we've already warmed. So that's a lot of additional global warming, and each fraction of a degree of warming is going to be more painful than the last because of things like the exponentiality of the water vapor in the atmosphere. The fact that even though the warming may be linear, the impacts of that warming are decidedly not linear, and I think that's becoming more and more clear over time. And it's partly just a matter of physics, because the water vapor holding capacity of the atmosphere scales exponentially with linear increases in temperature. So it's a 7% increase per degree centigrade of warming, which means that the actual increment of increase is larger for every degree of warming than for the last degree of warming. It's like compound interest in the bank. I said this before, it'd be great if we could all get 7% interest, in a checking account. That's not how the world works, but that is how the atmosphere works. We do see that 7% per degree centigrade of warming exponential growth in both the atmosphere's capacity to hold water vapor, meaning its capacity to generate extreme precipitation events, and also in its capacity to extract water from the landscape. So by the virtue of that same coin, not only do we raise the ceiling on how extreme precipitation can become in a warming climate at an exponential rate, but we also raise the potential for the atmosphere to extract water from plants and from the soil at an exponential rate. And I think that's, in a nutshell, what explains a lot of the things we're seeing around the world generally right now. And it also explains the kinds of extremes we've seen in California in recent years. Yes, we will see more intense droughts in California in a warming climate. We're already seeing much worse wildfires, and that's partly, according to some studies, perhaps even primarily because of this increasing water vapor extractive potential by the atmosphere. It's just an increasingly demanding atmosphere, demanding more and more water that may or may not be available in plants, from the soil, from bodies of water, and etc. And on the other hand, we see this increase in the availability of water vapor during storm events. We saw some record-breaking precipitation this past winter. We just broke a bunch of summertime precipitation records in California, including ones that have been standing for over a century. It was no coincidence that the atmosphere was record moist. There's never been a day in recorded history with as much moisture in the atmosphere over Southern California and Southern Nevada as yesterday. And so that manifested as record-breaking rainfall, unsurprisingly, in the context of this tropical storm. So, that effect occurs even if we don't often see tropical storms in California, even if it's something you can count, on one hand the number of times that happens a century. This increase in water vapor, heavier and heavier precipitation when they do show up. And that's a bit of an edge case, honestly, compared to the much more pressing risk of increasingly moist and increasingly wet winter storms in California. Every year we see significant winter storms in California, and those are likely going to be the things that deliver some of the worst flood risk to most of the state. Southeastern deserts are a bit of an exception. They do tend to be more susceptible to these rare but very high impact summertime tropical remnant flood events. But everywhere else in the state, the primary risk actually comes from winter storms. But both of them are getting moister, carrying more water vapor, and potentially dropping more rain per time and leading to increased flood risk. So that's sort of what the big picture is from the 30,000 foot view is there. Lengthy answer to a question that may have been a little bit tangential, but hopefully you got what you're looking for there. Question from Michelle, if I have any information on how Death Valley and also the Needles area fared. I actually have heard nothing from Death Valley other than that there was flooding and that the park is closed. So I mentioned this earlier in the call. I don't know if that means that was more ordinary flooding and that, anytime it rains in Death Valley, something floods. That's just the way it is. Or whether it was verging more on catastrophic flooding, because I do think it's likely that Death Valley set a new all-time rainfall record yesterday. But did it fall in a few hours, or did it fall gradually over 12 to 24 hours? That I don't know. That will probably dictate whether it was a hugely destructive flood or more of a beneficial flood that will result in some interesting super blooms later in the desert. The super blooms actually will probably happen either way, but whether or not it was a destructive flood will probably dictate whether you can go there to see them, because there may or may not be a road to get you there. So I guess we'll find out. Just glancing down at the radar, and there is still a tornado warning down by Los Banos and Mendota. Another severe thunderstorm warning. So there's just this cluster of nasty thunderstorms right along I-5. Not a good time to be on I-5 driving through the Central Valley in Merced County. Yeah, looks like a mess. Let's see. Would you say that the southeastern deserts benefited both from the reduced rain rates as well as the fact that Hilary tracked more westward? Yeah, that's also a possibility. It was within the cone of uncertainty, but it was at the far western edge of that cone. So that's also a plausible secondary reason for why. I do think if Hilary had been 30 or 40 miles further north, the strength of the upslope flow in the peninsular ranges, eastern San Diego and Riverside counties, probably would have been higher. So I think that's another plausible mechanism. Let's see here. Oh yeah, there's the question of whether I thought the storm was, quote, overhyped. I mean, I think this is a difficult question to answer, since there are now literally people who make, I guess they call them hype videos for storms. So, those are on TikTok, I guess, and they're sometimes on YouTube. I mean, what do you think those are going to be like? So, sure, I'm sure there was, but I think there was also just a widespread misconception on two different levels. One is there was a widespread notion this was going to be some epic, historical, massively destructive storm for the actual urban corridor from San Diego to Los Angeles, which was never at all in the forecast. They've been super, super crystal clear about that messaging in these live sessions and in the blog posts and media conversations. A notable storm, because it rarely rains at all in LA and San Diego in the summer, so to get a couple inches of rain in tropical world. On the other hand, a lot of folks assume that, because that was the over the mountains and deserts, whereas actually, I don't think the language from the Weather Service about potentially catastrophic flooding was unjustified. I think that was appropriate language. As it was, some of the flooding was catastrophic. I mean, having bridges wash away and whole canyons filled with car-sized boulders knocking down trees and buildings and pushing them downstream. I don't know what you'd call that, but that does fit the Weather Service definition of floods that are both potentially deadly and certainly destructive. But did it, but we did I think avert worse outcomes than were plausible because we didn't see those 3 to 4 inch. So let me put it this way. If there'd been some more sunny gaps in the clouds, had the storm been 30 or 40 miles further east, which is within the envelope of predictability, we wouldn't have been able to know either of those things until they were actively unfolding. And we did get those 3 or 4 inch per hour rainfall rates that were physically plausible on the eastern side of the storm on any widespread basis. The flooding just would have just obliterated some of these communities along the eastern slopes of the high desert. That is just the unfortunate reality. The fortunate reality is that it wasn't that bad because we didn't see those 3 to 4 inch hour rates. But, what would have been the alternative instead of, should that not have been part of the conversation? I think that would have been a very poor way of approaching the communication. So was it overhyped for coastal areas? Probably yes, but that's not really the fault of the Weather Service. That's more just hyperbolic newspaper headlines, and it is becoming impossible to use as a reliable source. Twitter was, by the way, for the first time that I can remember since I started using it in 2011, almost completely useless yesterday. I could not consistently get information, and a lot of the information that was there about California weather and Hilary was either conspiracy theories, fabricated, so there were some images that were obviously, they weren't even like nice generative AI scarily accurate things. They were still just good old like Microsoft Paint and Photoshop level fake images. There were lots of videos circulating from places that weren't California, so it was showing these massive torrents of water coming down canyons from like Saudi Arabia or Peru in previous years, claiming it was the LA basin or something. There is an unverified report that a certain senator may have exclaimed surprise over the fake image of, at this point, a meme image of a shark, supposedly the 405 freeway. Obviously, that didn't happen, but I think it's a play on people's susceptibility to sort of getting sucked into some of this stuff on social media that isn't real, that is simultaneously both exaggerated and understated. And so either it's a conspiracy theory that the Weather Service is like trying to pretend that this storm is some massive event that it isn't, to gain clicks for the Weather Service or something, I don't know, or that this event was somehow just not real, that it didn't actually rain. As I said last night, I mean, you tell me, if you're in Los Angeles, if it rained yesterday or not. There's a pretty widespread conspiracy that it didn't actually rain in Southern California yesterday at all, and this was all just made up. So just as you can see, the landscape for information gathering when it comes to weather and climate online is god-awful and getting worse. And yesterday was the first time it made me realize that I think I can't use Twitter anymore reliably during any sort of weather real-time event. It just isn't. Even as I would say I'm a pretty skillful Twitter power user for over a decade, and yet I can't discern. A lot of the information isn't there anymore. People have left, and B, what's left is a lot of conspiracy theories, hate speech, fake imagery, people claiming that an event is either not real or that it's so bad that it's going to obliterate, Los Angeles. I don't think that's all that's happening, but I think it's part of it. I think that's why there was a run on grocery stores in LA and San Diego. There was no need for people to go stock up on bread and milk. This was not, was not going to be that kind of event in LA and San Diego. It was never expected to be. It was not communicated by me or the Weather Service or anyone in any official capacity as being such. And yet there was a risk of catastrophic flooding in the mountains and deserts. That ended up not being quite as bad as it could have been, but was still quite bad and plausibly could have been a lot worse in ways that we wouldn't have been able to know in advance. So was that a reasonable messaging? I'm not really sure how much better you can do than that. I mean, we saw the wettest day in summer history in most of Southern California yesterday, and there was flooding of various degrees of severity along with tropical storm force winds. It is what it is. I've been thinking a lot about what this means, where to go on social media. I'm glad that this YouTube channel is becoming more popular because I think it's nice. I'm looking forward to having better hardware so I don't run into the technical issues. But I am still really searching for a tech-centric, real-time social media option that, unfortunately, Twitter or X or whatever it is this week doesn't seem to be anymore. And I have a Mastodon account, but it's very insular. It's mostly scientists talking to each other. It's not a mass messaging tool, and it is genuinely confusing. I know a lot of folks claim that it's not, but I mean, the fact that, again, I'm pretty tech savvy, and it was not entirely straightforward to get spun up there, and I still can't find what I'm looking for most of the time. And then Blue Sky, which is functionally very similar to Twitter. I like the interface. The signal to noise ratio is very high, which is great, but there's still like no one there because it's invitation only, and I'm not comfortable switching to it exclusively because it's not a mass messaging tool. A lot of people can't get access still. Threads has no app. It's not chronological. I've still had difficulty even signing up for it. So I don't know if somebody. I'm really waiting for the next good one to show up. I'm still on Twitter because even in its vastly degraded and still declining form, it is still better than the alternatives. But there will come a point, I think, where that's no longer true, either because it continues to decline or because some of the competitors, scale up and improve. So I have no real allegiance to it, except that it is still, even in this state, the most effective way to reach a lot of people quickly and to have a chronological timeline with searchable hashtags. It doesn't seem like that's a lot to ask, but so far that's been my experience. It hasn't been replicated anywhere else yet. So that's my tangential. Sort of opinion piece for the day. Let me keep going down the questions here. Matthew mentions that the National Weather Service automated rain gauge, I believe that would be at Nyland, shows 25 inches of rain. Instrument malfunction or credible? I mean, honestly, it's likely to be an overestimate, but given the kind of atmosphere we had, I wouldn't necessarily say that with confidence. Automated rain gauges are not as reliable as manual ones still. They're not as quality controlled, so it's possible that something above 20 inches happened, in which case it would be notable for the record book, so probably will be followed up on. But I would lean on the side of that probably being a data error from an automated station, but I guess we'll see. It takes a lot of time to post-process some of these rainfall records, actually, because you really do have to validate whether or not the stations were behaving reliably. Subway, which was actually the tram ride at Universal Studios, where you go through a fake subway station that has undergone a disaster. So again, it's be careful when you're out there on social media. Let's see here. Just continuing to take a look at the comments here. Yeah, I think if Threads really does come out with a desktop version this week, then maybe I will try to get on there harder, especially given that they have a chronological feed. So there are other things. I'm not a fan of the way that any of the big tech companies have managed social media, but I'm not an idealist. I'm definitely a pragmatist in that regard. So I will go where the people are, and that has the functionality that is the basic functionality that's needed, and has some at least very basic level of control on active misinformation. So we will see. Maybe I'll check that out on the new laptop later this week. Let's see here. Continuing to look down the comments here. Okay, there's some positive language about threads. So again, I'm not, I have no hard line against it. I just haven't used it because honestly, it's very difficult for me to access social media on my phone. I almost exclusively consume social media on my phone. I do not generate content via the phones. It's like physically difficult for me to do it with my fingers. So I almost always do that from larger screens and keyboards. So once if there's a desktop version or even a web app, that's fine as long as you can open it on your computer, which has not been the case with Threads. That might push me over there too. Yeah, one point is that official government agencies are not on Threads. A lot of them do have presence on Twitter still, and this is going to be a problem because having spoken to a lot of folks at the federal government who are involved with social media and outreach, it is so difficult to get permission internally. Like, it took years to get government agencies on Twitter. Some of them are just showing up this year. And so at the current pace of change, it'll be another 10 years before they can get on Threads, and by that time we will have moved on to the next great thing. So there is still a real risk of churn and loss in transitioning platforms, and I was really holding out hope that that wouldn't be necessary, but I just think it's looking more and more like that is inevitable. So let's make this the last question since I need to actually do some other work today. It's been a long week. I think it's a good one. It's come up a couple times. Is the National Hurricane Center still trying to figure out Hilary's exact path yesterday and what the working theories are as to why the storm tracked on the western edge of the cone? I do think there's a little bit of uncertainty regarding the exact center of circulation was. It looks now like the official path literally has it following the exact coastline up from about Imperial Beach, so literally on the border fence on the Pacific Ocean between Tijuana and Imperial Beach, following the coastline up somewhere to the Orange County, LA County border. The coastline is not perfectly straight between those 2 points. The line they drew is perfectly straight, which would suggest that it actually technically made a second landfall in California, which would make it the first landfalling tropical storm or greater strength tropical cyclone to make landfall in California officially since 1939. Why, the more general question though that was more meaningful meteorologically is why did the storm end up on the western edge of the envelope? Part of it is just sometimes these wobbles of storm systems. It's just sort of a basic product of what happens when you combine Newtonian physics with the chaos that is inherent to the atmosphere. Some of those wobbles are just not predictable. That's why there is always that uncertainty cone. So there's partly that. The other part of it is that the system was transitioning to an extratropical cyclone. So it was undergoing a metamorphosis from a warm core tropical cyclone to a cold core mid-latitude storm right as it was going over Southern California. That may have caused the center to sort of reform to the west of where it once was. So rather than imagining it as a low pressure center that moved suddenly from point A to point B, it's kind of imagining a low pressure center that kind of drifts up towards point A as it weakens, and as a new low pressure center a little bit to the west of that place starts to deepen as this one is weakening, and essentially what happens if the storm is officially strengthened, then all of a sudden you sort of have it makes it look like the storm jumps from point A to point B, whereas it really was a gradual incremental process where the low pressure on the western flank of the system was deepening as the low pressure on the eastern flank was weakening, and so it just kind of based on the way we define where storms are located was further west. There will, as I mentioned, be some post-season analysis. There will probably be some close analysis of maps, surface meteorological maps, maybe even, I know some folks in the meteorology world still like to print these out, hang them on the wall, draw with Sharpies. Not that kind of Sharpie and not that kind of wall, but anyway, I think that there will be some interesting insights to come out of that later on, whether or not it made a second landfall in California. Whether that was responsible for why the rains ended up heavier in LA County and Ventura County than expected and somewhat lighter than expected in the far southeastern counties of California. I think that's perhaps a decent part of it. But that'll be, in the end, at this point, that's mainly an academic exercise. This was a record-breaking summer rainfall event for Southern California. It produced widespread flooding. Much of which was more on the minor to moderate end of the spectrum. But I do think that we will see images later today coming out once the helicopters get in there and the rescue crews get in there of more significant flooding than occurred elsewhere. So I'm glad it wasn't more widespread, but I do think it was still quite severe in some isolated areas. Let's see what happens to Death Valley and the accessibility to Death Valley, and let's not forget the fact that this, for the damage that it caused, has probably attenuated fire season to a good extent, at least in the southern half-ish, or the southeastern half-ish, as I called it, since it is sort of at that angle of the state, at least for weeks to a month or so. So it's certainly remarkable, probably a historic event. I think fair to say historic event, actually, because we did break all-time summer rainfall records, so what is that if not historic? Let's be thankful that it wasn't worse, but acknowledge that it was in some smaller mountain and desert communities, it's actually quite bad today. So I don't think that feels like much reassurance if you're in one of those places right now. So with all of that said, I think I'm actually going to keep this one to an hour. I'm going to probably not have another live session this week, since I've accumulated 2 months worth of live sessions since Thursday. But I'll try and have another one next, burning out my processor. Bonus might be the background fan noise might go away. So in addition to having fewer interruptions in the feed, the audio quality might improve. I promise I have essentially a professional studio microphone that I use, but the problem is there's just so much background noise coming from my ancient processor that I think it gets drowned out. So that should work better moving forward. I got some eggshell sound absorbing panels to put around the room. So anyway, hopefully that'll be in place by next week. So thanks again for joining. I really do enjoy these sessions, and I enjoy the way I am able to connect with hundreds of people pretty directly via the comments. I'm getting a little bit better at assimilating and reading through them. Whoops, I just triggered my smartphone AI. Who knows what I said in that sentence. But thanks again. Stay safe out there. If you do have interesting reports of damage well beyond what's been reported in the news, let me know. Or cool images or dramatic images. I always like to see those. But otherwise, stay safe out there. If you have to deal with cleanup, hopefully it's not too bad.